This is Part 2 of the Chinook Fund online grant application workshop. In Part 2, we will cover an explanation of the Chinook Fund's 3 key funding criteria, which are 1. Constituent-led, 2. Community-wide, and 3. Lasting effect. We will also cover an exploration of additional guidelines, including who we do and do not fund, and funding categories, multi-year grants, and funding deadlines. Key guidelines: constituent-led. Constituent-led means that the work is led by the people most impacted by injustice. Unlike a traditional charity model, we believe that those most affected by the issue have the solutions and vision for their own liberation, and that the development of their leadership, skills, and power should be prioritized. Example: an organization working on issues affecting youth should include youth leadership at all levels of the organization and ensure that youth are at the forefront of deciding what issues they want to fight. Key guidelines: community-wide. Community-wide means that the work reflects all members of the constituency or community, especially those who experience multiple forms of oppression. This ensures that change for the community leaves no one behind, especially for those who have less privilege within the community. Organizations may define their constituency in very broad terms, in very narrow terms, or anywhere in between. However, regardless of the constituency the organization represents, it is important that the full range of identities within that group be represented. It is common for organizations, even organizations focused on addressing the oppressions experienced by one or more groups, to represent the more privileged members of those groups and not address the realities and concerns of group members who carry multiple targeted identities. An example of community-wide work is as follows. An organization fighting violence against women should include the leadership of women of color, lesbian, bisexual, and queer women, low-income women, transgender and gender nonconforming women, and women with disabilities to ensure that their work makes change for the entire community of women affected by this issue. In the case of this example, all of these groups of women experience oppressions, barriers, and concerns that both overlap and are different. For instance, the institutional barriers faced by a low-income woman with disabilities or a transgender woman of color will be very different than the institutional barriers faced by a white, middle-class, cisgender, or gender-conforming woman who does not have disabilities. If particular attention is not paid to the specific realities faced by each group of women, the organization will not be able to address all of the root causes of violence against women. And it is likely that the organization, regardless of its intentions, will exclude the women whose experiences it is not familiar with. Key guidelines: lasting effect. Lasting effect means that the work makes change not just for one individual today, but for the community as a whole and for future generations. Generally, this means organizing collective action to change cultural, social, political, and economic systems and institutions, such as housing, criminal justice, food production, healthcare, government agencies, immigration, media, etc. If you will recall, this is reflected in the change, not charity examples discussed in Part 1 of this video series, and it is important to remember that the Chinook Fund is committed to each aspect of social change work and social justice philanthropy. An example of this would be an organization working to challenge racist policies that exclude students of color from accessing high-quality education rather than an after-school tutoring program for students of color. In this example, an after-school tutoring program for students of color is a very worthwhile endeavor. However, it does not accomplish long-term social change. Instead, it focuses on a group of individual students. Students of color not participating in this program would not receive its benefits. And if something were to happen to the tutoring program, its benefit would only extend to those who had already participated in it. Additionally, such a program does not address the root causes of why students of color may need additional tutoring services, such as students of color having less access to high-quality education due to the legacy and current reality of racism. An organization working to change racist policies that exclude students of color from accessing high-quality education is ultimately working for the benefit of all of the students of color who would be impacted by the policies they are working to change. If something were to happen to the organization, future generations of students would still benefit from their work, so long as the policy revisions remained intact. Additionally, the organization would be working to address root causes of why students of color have less access to high-quality education, including the legacy and current realities of racism. An additional note about lasting effect. Providing trainings and workshops are an important organizing tool directed towards social change, but Chinook sees such programs as the beginning, not the end, of the social change process. Education expands and develops leadership, but such programs should also incorporate action that will lead to systemic change. Again, and this cannot be emphasized enough, an action component is critical. Consciousness raising may represent one important step toward action, but organizations must demonstrate either that they are connecting this consciousness raising to an unambiguous action and/or community organizing component, or lay out a clear plan for how consciousness raising will be effectively linked to action steps and/or community organizing. Whether or not an organization participates in consciousness raising, an action and/or community organizing component must be clearly represented. Chinook will consider proposals that seek to create community-based alternatives to the systems that are named in the grant application, as long as there is demonstrated need, action, and organizing for the alternative institution, as well as clear examples of change that will result for the community. Who we fund. The Chinook Fund funds groups based in communities facing injustice or oppression, including but not limited to communities of color, low-income communities, immigrant communities, LGBTQ communities, disability communities. The Chinook Fund recognizes that there are many forms of oppression, and we recognize that the examples we gave represent only a partial list. If your organization addresses sexism, religious oppression, cissexism, or other forms of oppression, we will certainly honor and recognize that. The Chinook Fund funds groups with budgets under $350,000. If you are an organization with a fiscal sponsor, please note that we are only concerned with your budget, not your fiscal sponsor's budget. This means that if your fiscal sponsor's budget exceeds $350,000, but yours does not, you are still eligible under the funding limit. Please note, however, that programs that are part of a larger organization should count the budget of their entire organization, not just their program. This is because programs are run as part of the whole organization and are therefore able to draw on all of its resources. In-kind donations are not counted toward the budget limit. We also fund groups that have democratic leadership, decision-making, and organizing that is led by and accountable to people most directly impacted by the issue or injustice. Groups who are engaged in efforts to dismantle privilege and oppression within their organization and community, and groups who demonstrate that their work can lead to permanent progressive change for their community. We do not fund direct services to individuals. Please note that the Chinook Fund recognizes that direct services are sometimes a critical element of larger social justice work. For instance, in an organization that is working with a group whose basic survival needs are not being met, it may be necessary for that organization to help participants meet these basic survival needs before they can engage in action and/or community organizing work. However, in order to qualify for Chinook funding, organizations that provide direct services must also have a substantive, action, and/or community organizing component. If a substantive, action, and/or community organizing component does not exist, or if clear and well-laid plans toward this goal are not specified, the organization will not qualify for funding. The Chinook Fund also does not fund groups with budgets over $350,000. Organizations that exceed $350,000 in their current fiscal year or in their next fiscal year are not eligible for funding. Individuals or organizations controlled by one individual are not eligible for funding, nor are scholarship requests. Profit-making organizations, with the exception of worker-owned cooperatives, are also not eligible. Other foundations or pass-through funding, organization whose work or decision-making body is based outside of Colorado, with possible exceptions for regional indigenous groups, are also not eligible. The regional exception applies to groups that organize indigenous communities that cross Colorado's borders, for instance, New Mexico or Arizona. However, there still needs to be a connection to communities within Colorado. The exemption does not apply to indigenous groups that are based in other states or explicitly national organizations. We also do not fund attempts to influence the election of individuals for public office or direct union organizing. Priority is given to groups that work in alliance and collaboration with other organizations, are strategic and work with a long-term vision that is clearly linked to current work plans, have achieved concrete success that have positively impacted the community, see themselves as part of a larger movement for social justice, have limited access to traditional funding sources, raise money from multiple sources, including grassroots and individual donor fundraising, shift paradigms and offer alternatives to existing institutions and systems that perpetuate injustice, take risks by doing work that is controversial, marginalized, and/or new and emerging, and intentionally evaluate their work. Funding categories. There are two key funding categories: startup grants and established grants. Startup grants apply to organizations that are 4 years old or younger, and organizations may apply for up to $4,000 worth of funding. The Chinook Fund provides seed grants to new organizations who demonstrate potential for creating effective social change. Many startup grants go to groups who work with new communities, new issues, and new methods of social justice work that are often considered too new, risky, or radical by other funders. An organization is eligible to apply for startup funding multiple times. So long as the organization is 4 years old or younger, they are eligible for startup funding. Established grants. A group is eligible for established grants at any age. Therefore, the age of the group is not relevant. And when applying for established grants, one may ask for up to $10,000 worth of funding. Chinook provides grants to organizations who demonstrate a track record of making effective social change. Many of these organizations count on Chinook's general operating money to support the more radical, long-term, and sometimes confrontational work to create systemic change that is often restricted by other funding. Applications must indicate whether they are applying as a startup or established group. Groups can indicate their choice on the grant application cover sheet, which is seen here. Please note that applicants will not be moved from one category to another after they have submitted their applications. Also note that on the grant application cover sheet, an organization can indicate their organizational status. This means that they can designate whether they are a 501c3, are incorporated but not a 501c3, are unincorporated, in which case they should contact staff before applying for funding, or have a fiscal sponsor. Organizations that have a fiscal sponsor are asked to list their fiscal sponsor. There is no limit to the number of times an organization can apply for or receive funding, so long as they fall within the funding guidelines. Our startup and established funds work together to strategically support the social justice movement. By seeding organizations, we are investing in the potential future of social justice work, and once they take root, we provide great support to organizations that have the greatest impact for long-term change. MultiYear Grants, 2-year term. Chinook Fund has now established multi-year grant funding. This has certain qualifications for eligibility. Established grantees who have been funded by Chinook at least twice during the last 5 years and who receive the highest level of funding in the current cycle will be considered by the grant-making committee for multi-year funding. Please note again that this only applies to established grantees who have been funded by the Chinook Fund at least twice during the last 5 years at the highest level of funding. Awardees will be offered funding for a second year without having to go through the full application and site visit process. They will most likely have to submit a renewal application. Awardees will be required to submit a progress report and updated financials for the second year of funding. Please note, we cannot guarantee the same dollar amount for the second year award due to the way we allocate funding. If an organization qualifies for a multi-year grant, they will automatically be submitted for consideration. Applicants do not have to do anything to indicate their interest in multi-year funding. Other important notes. Tax-exempt status. Chinook does not require groups to have 501c3 tax-exempt status in order to receive funding. However, the activities for which you are requesting funding must fit within the IRS tax-exempt eligibility requirements. Please contact staff if you are unincorporated or without a fiscal sponsor. General operating support. Chinook prefers to give general operating dollars to groups whose overall mission and work align with our criteria for social change. General operating dollars can be used for any organizational expense, including staff, equipment, rent, utilities, fundraising, or programming. However, if your organization has a specific program or project that needs support, which more strongly aligns with Chinook's funding criteria, you may consider applying for project support. Please contact staff if you are unsure which type of support to apply for. Funding deadlines. Check the Chinook Fund website for upcoming spring and fall deadlines. You can reach the Chinook Fund website at http://www.chinookfund.org. Grants must be postmarked or delivered to the office by no later than 5 p.m. on the deadline date. Please make sure all proposals are mailed or dropped off to Chinook Fund's current address, which is 3280 Downing Street, Suite B, Denver, Colorado, 80205. This concludes Part 2 of the 3-part online grant application workshop series.